Shabbat Shalom. Yes, Christine, I see your connection is not great. So maybe you should turn off your camera. That might make it better. That sometimes helps with the bandwidth. Okay, good morning. And we're going to say the blessing for studying Torah, and then we'll review where we are because it's been a few weeks. So let me share the blessing. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. Blessed are you, Adonai, our God, sovereign of all, who hallows us with mitzvot, commanding us to engage in words with words of Torah. Okay, so we are towards the end of the book of Nehemiah, which is pretty amazing. We've been racing through the Tanakh. Anybody remember what happened in the last class? Where we were? The very important chapters 8 and 9 of Nehemiah. Okay, this is, as I have mentioned in the past, this book really marks the transition from the Israelite religion to Judaism, because you went from the center of your worship is at the temple where you sacrifice animals, and now we have a scroll that has been brought by Ezra, the scribe, the prophet, the priest. He brings the scroll of the Torah, right? And now we have a written document. Now the transition hasn't happened completely yet. We have to wait till the year 70 when the temple is actually completely destroyed and there's no option to worship at the temple. But right now, the temple has been rebuilt, a much more modest version. And we have the scroll of the Torah available. The chapters that we read at the end of last time were when Ezra brings the scroll, the Torah, to the people. Remember, he is on a platform and he reads it to the people who assemble there, right? And he gives an interpretation as he's reading. The very, very beginning of Midrash. And, you know, this is a really important moment in Jewish history. And when we talk about, for example, right now, we know that the Jewish world is not what it used to be, right? And in fact, yesterday, I found out that this little congregation in Beaumont is closing. Like at one point they had 60 families. It's, you know, I think they meet in a community center or something. I don't think they have a building, but, you know, it was a little congregation. Well, they're shutting down. They had a rabbi and everything. They're shutting down because they don't have enough people who are interested, and the people who were interested are either dying or whatever. So we know that this is happening all around the country, not just for Judaism, but for Christianity as well. So the question is, do we panic or do we look at the past for moments when this kind of thing was happening? So, you know, we usually say that in the year 70, that's when we went from the biblical religion to Judaism, right? Because we no longer had a temple. But all of this stuff was brewing beforehand. So the idea that you had Jews in exile or Israelites in exile in Babylonia, that's theoretically where they put the Torah together. That's where they emphasize what was important. For example, the Sabbath, right? The first chapter of the Tanakh talks about Shabbat as holy. So they're establishing holiness and the possibility of holiness outside the land of Israel, right? You can observe Shabbat anywhere, anytime. Well, not anytime, it's Shabbat, but anyway, you can, you know, observe it any place. There is one issue, though, of course, in the very northern country. What do you do about Shabbat when the sun never sets? That's a whole other story that somebody asked me to look into for them, because of a wedding they're doing in Norway or somewhere. Yeah, but you know, you can observe Shabbat anywhere. The Torah is portable. You know, they're beginning to come up with the elements of what's going to save Judaism, so to speak, right? A whole different way of doing the religion, because half of the mitzvot have to do with animal sacrifice, which we don't do. So it was very, very creative and very clever, and you know, the moment now calls for the same kind of creativity. Okay, so before we proceed with the next chapter, anybody have any questions? No? Oh, Melissa, go ahead.
Hi, good morning, everyone. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay, great. So I was thinking this morning of, maybe we need a campaign to target Jews in red states, something like, does it feel like 1938? Maybe
Oh
you should
dear.
come to Riverside. But I'm serious. I think that, when you're thinking, how are we going to save our temple, save our community? Um, there are definitely Jews places in the United States now that probably are looking at where they live and the fact that things are becoming increasingly hostile in these, Christian white evangelical nationalist places that might actually think Riverside looked pretty good. So, I think it is time for creativity.
Thank you. Okay, but I don't want to get into a whole discussion right now about how we can save Temple Bethel.
I thought that's what you were doing.
No, I just wanted to suggest that at this point in time,
Yeah.
we are at a similar
Mhm.
inflection point, as they say. Christine, go ahead.
Well, I think this is really part of a whole issue in general of how do you build community when
Yes.
increasingly it's a virtual
There is
set of
that.
connections, period.
That absolutely. And that's part of what happened with the pandemic. It as it increased the change, as Jane was saying earlier. But yeah, how do you create community when people are on their devices or on, whatever? And yet you have a community that's available, but they don't want to show up for it, right? Okay. Jason in the chat said, in response to Melissa trying to sell Riverside to people, just don't tell them about our sheriff, but that might bring people from the red states, right? Okay, we are going to go back to
we like to say
Nehemiah.
we're moderate. Nehemiah.
Okay, here's Nehemiah. And I'm going to read the beginning of this because I know that people don't like all these names. And I'm not going to read each one of them either because I'm glad they were there, but okay. So now let's just go back for 1 second to chapter 9, just because they're sealing a deal. So we need to know what the deal is that they're sealing. Okay. So after the Torah was read to them, they realized, we haven't been really such great people. I mean, we weren't doing the things we were supposed to do. They confessed their sins here in verse 2, right? They spent, a good part of the day listening to the book of the law, so-called, which is the Torah. And then they confessed and, cried and all of that. I mean, they're just feeling very, very guilty. And, they're saying to God, no, you are the only God. You chose Abraham. You redeemed us from Egypt. I mean, this is sort of a quick recap of the history of the Israelites. You gave us the 10 Commandments and the Torah and did all this stuff, but look at this. We were arrogant and stiff-necked. We didn't obey, right? We didn't remember the miracles that were performed for us, right? But of course, God is forgiving and gracious and compassionate, which we read at the high holidays, right? And that comes from the Torah, not from here. This is a repetition. And God is so compassionate, didn't abandon us, even though God had every reason to just toss us over, right? And then you had we multiplied like the stars. We took over the land of Canaan. We were all very fertile and everything went so well, but we were so awful. We rebelled and killed your prophets, which we'll talk about a little bit later. And there were all these warnings, but we still didn't listen. Okay. Now, therefore, our God, the great God, mighty and awesome, you have acted faithfully while we acted wickedly, etc., etc. We see we are slaves today, slaves of the land you gave our ancestors. They're slaves because essentially God has sent various empires to conquer the land as a punishment. So even though they were liberated from slavery in Egypt, now they're essentially slaves to all these other empires, right? And they're in great distress. And then in view of all of this, we're making a binding agreement putting it in writing, and our leaders, our Levites, and our priests are affixing their seals to it. Okay. Okay, I just was trying to go to the next chapter and I got an ad for plumbing. Okay, I don't know why, but very weird. Okay. Yay, internet. Okay, so here are the people who sealed this deal. Nehemiah, right? And then all these other people, the Levites, all the people who are part of the Levites, the leaders of the people. And look at all these beautiful names. And then we get down here. Okay, who would like to pick it up here at the rest of the people?
I can read, Rabbi.
Thank you. Thank you,
The
Jen.
rest of the people, priests, Levites, gatekeepers, musicians, temple servants, and all who separated themselves from the neighboring peoples for the sake of the law of God, together with their wives and all their sons and daughters who are able to understand. All these now join their fellow Israelites, the nobles, and bind themselves with a curse and an oath to follow the law of God, given through Moses, the servant of God, and to obey carefully all the commands, regulations, and decrees of the Lord our God. What do they mean when they said they bind themselves with a curse? What is that?
I believe that means that if they do not obey, they will be cursed.
Oh, but they didn't curse God or anything.
No.
Yeah. Oh, okay.
The curse will be a punishment of some kind. You remember?
Oh, okay.
Remember at
Okay.
the end of Deuteronomy, you had
Right.
The curses and the blessings, and
Right.
if you do not obey my commandment, what's going to happen?
Okay.
You're going to have all kinds of hideous things happen. Which
Yeah, it's just the way that they
that's the
put
way.
it.
Let me just
a
see
little
how.
confusing.
Let me just see how Alter translates that verse. Let's see, which one is it?
It's
29. Okay, let me see how he translates that. Oh, it's interesting. Actually, his chapter 10 starts with the last verse of chapter 9 in this translation.
Oh.
Because, they say we make a solemn promise, a commitment to write this down and seal it. That's the end of the last chapter here, but Alter put it in as the beginning, which makes a certain amount of sense. But anyway, so let me see what he says for 29. The priests, the Levites, the gatekeepers, the choristers, the temple laborers, that all separated themselves from the peoples of the land according to God's teaching, their wives, their sons, etc., whoever had conscious understanding. Oh, you know what? It's going to be a different verse number because he changed the order here. Let's see. And the people see. I'm trying to find exact. Why don't you keep reading? I'm trying to read exactly where he put this.
We promise not to give our daughters in marriage to the peoples around us or take their daughters for our sons. When the neighboring peoples bring merchandise or grain to sell on the Sabbath, we will not buy from them on the Sabbath or any other holy day. Every 7th year, we will forgo working the land and will cancel all debts. We assume the responsibility for carrying out the commands to give 1/3 of a shekel each year for the service of the house of our God, for the bread set out on the table, for the regular grain offerings and burnt offerings, for the offerings on the Sabbaths, at the new moon feasts, and at the appointed festivals, for the holy offerings, for sin offerings, to make atonement for Israel, and for all the duties of the house of God.
Okay, let's just stop for a moment. First of all, he doesn't use that expression at all. So he says, whoever has conscious understanding, holding fast with their brothers, their leaders, and entering into the oath and the vow to walk in God's teaching that was given by Moses, servant of God, and to keep and to do all the commands of the Lord our master and his laws and his statutes. So there's nothing in there about binding ourselves with a curse.
Yeah.
It's an oath and a vow. So, that's not how apparently the Hebrew doesn't have that in it exactly like that. This is just, again, every translation is an interpretation of some kind. So anyway, it's to give it, I think, a lot of power. Like, we are willing to do this, to make this commitment, and understand that if we disobey God, we will be in deep trouble. Okay.
Mhm.
Now notice in verse 31, it's so confusing because his verses are different, because of how we divided the chapters. But anyway, so then you see here the Sabbath is really privileged here, right? In terms of all, if ever, oop, I don't log in. God, okay. So remember, again, the very first chapter of the Torah talks about the holiness of the Sabbath, right? That's in the very, very, very beginning. And so if we, let's say, accept the scholarly understanding that the Torah was edited in Babylonia, possibly by Ezra, they have been exiled. The temple has been destroyed. This is 586 BCE and later. And so they are trying to recreate Judaism in a way that is viable for people who may not be in the land of Israel. So one of the things is to make the Sabbath very important, and to make the festivals very important, to create a calendar that we can live in a Jewish way, no matter where we are. Okay.
Right.
The other thing I want to ask folks, when you look at what it is that the Israelites supposedly, did wrong, what was the nature of what they did wrong?
Fought with each other.
Okay, they fought with each other, but what category?
They didn't follow the commands.
But which commands in particular seem to be the most important here?
Shabbat.
Shabbat's the most important command.
Serving God.
Serving God. Say more.
Worshiping idols, not serving God in a proper way.
Intermarriage.
Okay, so good. So the focus here, it's important to notice this, especially since we are going to touch a little bit on Isaiah. The focus is on the ritual end of things, right? Serving God, not serving idols, right? You have not been loyal to me, a jealous God, right? I mean, unfortunately, that's how it's articulated in here, that God is jealous. And, if you serve any other gods, that's what an idol means. You're in deep trouble if you don't observe the Sabbath and the festivals and the calendar and all of that. Is there anything in here about you were cruel to people? You did not take care of the stranger, the widow, and the orphan. You did not pursue justice. Is there anything like that in here?
No, the emphasis, I think as you've said, the emphasis is all on ritual, which
Exactly.
you can carry out anywhere. You
Right.
don't need a temple in order to do it.
Of course, you
You
can
can
also
do
carry out
this
justice
law.
anywhere, but
Yeah, but and also I get the feeling that the Israelites had forgotten special days, special festivals, like the celebration of the new moon, for
Yeah.
example, which is the way they kept their calendar.
right.
So everything here is ritual.
Exactly. And because part of the festival is, thanking God for what we have, giving God and the priest part of our harvest, right? So it's really important, because this is really the history section of the Bible is Deuteronomic to a great extent, even here, even though it's out after all the prophets. But it's about, being loyal to God. And if not, you get into deep trouble. We will see when we get to the prophets, the books of the prophets, not the historical prophets, but Isaiah, etc., that the emphasis is way more on justice. As a matter of fact, we read, okay, let me ask you, pop quiz. We read about some Isaiah during Yom Kippur. And what is it that we read about at that point in terms of all of this that we've been talking about? What's Isaiah's point?
Justice thou shalt pursue.
Okay. That's also from Deuteronomy, absolutely. But remember, what is it that Isaiah is railing about in the Haftorah that we read in the morning.
Empty sacrifices.
Empty sacrifices. Thank you. So while all of this Deuteronomic history is about trying to be ritually, loyal to God and not worshiping other kinds of gods. Okay. When you get to Isaiah and Jeremiah and all those other prophets, the emphasis is on social justice. And Isaiah is saying, I don't want your fasting and all your rituals that you're doing, they're empty. It's not that, he's saying you shouldn't do them, but what does it mean to fast for a whole day and then go out and exploit your workers? Or you go to synagogue every Shabbat and you cheat people in your business or whatever it is. Like, it's empty. Don't, it's like people who are so, more pious and more self-righteous than anybody else, right? But that doesn't mean that they're behaving in such a great way. So don't just come to the temple with your sacrifices. Don't come with your confessions. Don't come with all, if it doesn't mean anything, because if it means that you're going to go out and be a bad person, I'm not interested. Okay, there's a message in chat. Oh, okay. Yeah, it's about Christine's connection, which is very bad. All right. Yes, please, Sandy.
It kind of, because Mother's Day is tomorrow, I guess, it kind of reminded me of people who ignore their parents all year long, but send them a card on Mother's Day. Like, it's
okay. That's a good example. Absolutely. So it's just interesting, especially since we're sort of on the cusp of ending the book of Nehemiah. We only have a couple more chapters. And then if we start with Isaiah, there's a real difference between the two. So I just wanted you to notice that. All right, we're going to continue reading. Okay, Jane, let's see. We're down here.
We are, I need you to move it up, I think.
Sure. Verse 34.
Thank you. We, the priests, the Levites, and the people, have cast lots to determine when each of our families is to bring to the house of our God at set times each year a contribution of wood to burn on the altar of the Lord our God, as it is written in the law. We also assume responsibility for bringing to the house of the Lord each year the first fruits of our crops and of every fruit tree. And it is also written in the law, we will bring the firstborn of our sons and of our cattle, of our herds and of our flocks to the house of our God, to the priests ministering there. Moreover, we will bring to the storerooms of the house of our God, to the priests, the first of our ground meal, of our grain offerings, of the fruit of all of our trees, and of our new wine and olive oil. And we will bring a tithe of our crops to the Levites, for it is the Levites who collect the tithes in all the towns where we work. A priest descended from Aaron is to accompany the Levites when they receive the tithes, and the Levites are to bring 1/10 of the tithes up to the house of our God, to the storerooms of the treasury. The people of Israel, including the Levites, are to bring their contributions of grain, new wine, and olive oil to the storerooms, for the articles for the sanctuary and for the ministering priests. The gatekeepers and the musicians are also kept. We will not neglect the house of our God.
Thank you. Okay, Sandy.
Yeah, when it said bring the firstborn son, what are they going to do with it? They're going to be priests or what? I mean, they're not sacrificing.
I thought somebody was going to ask that question. Actually, so theoretically, the firstborn belongs to God.
Right.
So there is a ceremony that we have called Pidyon Haben, where you redeem the firstborn. You pay some money to the temple, and then you get to keep your kid and not have the kid become either a sacrifice or a priest. Actually, we don't, in the Reform movement, we don't do that, but in the more traditional communities, they actually do a Pidyon Haben. And actually, there was a family that was, I think they're still members, although I haven't seen them in a long time. They asked me to do one for their son. because there was a parent in there who was more traditional. Yeah, I figured somebody would pick up on that. It's a little disturbing in a certain sense. Like, what does that mean? And probably the whole story of the Akedah, where Abraham almost sacrifices his kid. So there's some thought that it was actually originally written so that he is sacrificed, and then it changes, and the idea is no, you don't sacrifice your kid. But people did that in the ancient Near East. They put their kids in the fire, and we know that also from Greek tragedy. Jane.
This is part of the religious revolution that Yogi Brandes talks about, where the sacrifice is substituted by the Pinyan Haben, where you actually pay something to the temple, right?
Yes.
Is that you give cash,
yes.
something like that? I attended one of these a long time ago at Exodar, and the parents of the mother, parents of the mother were in Israel, so they did it over the phone, so that this was before all the Skype and stuff, but they did the ceremony so that they could hear it. So I've been to one of those, but this is what Yogi Brandeis says, that there was a revulsion against this, or a rebellion against this. She's very vague on time, on a timeline. But this is supposed to take the place of child sacrifice.
Right, exactly.
Which she insists the Israelites did. And I tend to believe.
You know what? In the very early days, they may very well have, which is maybe why that story was, written. I don't know. We don't know for sure. Any other comments or questions before we go to the next chapter? Okay, we're almost done. Amazing. Amazing. Yeah. Okay, here we go. Nehemiah. All right, we're going to the next chapter. Little arrow. There we go. Okay, who would like to read?
I can read.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, now the leaders of the people settled in Jerusalem. The rest of the people cast lots to bring 1 out of every 10 of them to live in Jerusalem, the holy city, while the remaining 9 were to stay in their own towns. The people commended all who volunteered to live in Jerusalem. These are the provincial leaders who settled in Jerusalem. Now some Israelites, priests, Levites, temple servants, and descendants of Solomon's servants lived in the towns of Judah, each on their own property in their various towns, while other people from both Judah and Benjamin lived in Israel.
Okay, I'm going to let you dispense with all these names, but let me just mention, because again, I have my notes from Alter, but then of course they don't match the same verse numbers. Okay, so the idea of casting lots, which they did in the last chapter, to pick who's going to be in what land and whatever, and then they're doing it here. So this is reminiscent of how the land was divided in the book of Joshua. They also did the same thing, with parceling out the settlements. And then also, they're sprinkling people around because, they're still in danger. The Samaritans don't want these people there, right? I mean, this is the story of Israel from way back. So they're trying to, spread out so that they can defend themselves. Okay, so here are all the names of all these people. I'm not going to make you read all these names.
Thank you.
Okay, but it's interesting how important it is here for things to be documented. Okay, I'm going to call on you again, Melissa, when we get to the next chapter. But but just look, we went from a very oral culture, right, where things were passed down from one to the other via what you said to each other. And here we have documentation that it's been inserted into this material. And it seems very important to them to document exactly who was where and what, and, okay. Here we are in chapter 12, which I believe, let's see. Now we have a couple more after that. One more. Okay. And then here are the priests and Levites who returned with Zerubbabel, right? And some more names and some more names. A lot of priestly families. Okay, and then here's some more. Okay, now we're going to dedicate the wall. Okay, now Melissa, you may come back and
At
read.
27?
Yes.
Okay, at the dedication of the wall in Jerusalem, the Levites were sought out from where they lived and were brought to Jerusalem to celebrate joyfully the dedication with songs of thanksgiving and with the music of cymbals, harps, and lyres. Is it lyres or lyres? The musicians also were brought together from the region around Jerusalem, from the village of Netophathetus, from Beth Gilgal, and from the areas of Geba and Asmaveth, close as I can do. For the musicians had built villages for themselves around Jerusalem. When the priests and Levites had purified themselves ceremonially, they purified the people, the gates, and the wall. I had the leaders of Judah go up on top of the wall. I also assigned 2 large choirs to give thanks.
Okay, we're going to skip these names, all these names again. Sorry, unless you really want to read them.
No, thank you.
Okay, so we have the choirs, they sang, they offered sacrifice, everybody rejoiced, the women and the children, etc. Okay, here we go.
So, okay, and then I have a question. 44. At the time, men were appointed to be in charge of the storerooms for the contributions, first fruits, and tithes. From the fields around the towns, they were to bring into the storerooms the portions required by the law for the priests and the Levites. For Judah was pleased with the ministering priests and Levites. They performed the service of their God and the service of purification, as did also the musicians and gatekeepers, according to the commands of David and his son Solomon. For long ago, in the days of David and Asaph, there had been directors for the musicians and for the songs of praise and thanksgiving to God. So in the days of Zerubbabel and of Nehemiah, all Israel contributed the daily portions for the musicians and the gatekeepers. They also set aside the portion for the other Levites, and the Levites set aside the portion for the descendants of Aaron.
Thank you. Okay, so let me just point out that, for long ago in the days of David, now let me just, want to see how he translates that, because let's see, that's 47 here.
So the question I had while you're looking involves the women and children were at the wall. And I know there's all the controversy about who gets to pray. Is this the same wall we're talking about here?
No, I'll go into that in a second. Okay, no, he doesn't have any great translation. But anyway, the point is that here they've rebuilt the wall, and it's sort of like make Israel great again. We're going back to the glory days of David, right? It's really not the glory days of David, because they're a little rump state that's, kind of left over, and they're still under other other empires. But there's this moment when, it's sort of like, it's sort of at the very, they're trying to come back to their days of glory. They're not going to, but, they feel like they have. Okay, so let me explain the difference. Okay, this wall, the wall that's built by Nehemiah, is a wall around Jerusalem to protect Jerusalem against, invasions or whatever. Okay, that is not the same as the wall that people pray at. The wall that people pray at is a retaining wall. So, as I said, when the temple was rebuilt in like 510 or whatever, it's really a very simplified version of the beautiful temple that Solomon had built. It wasn't until King Herod, who then spent a lot of money to build a lot of stuff in Israel, right? He built Masada, he built a lot of structures, because he was very paranoid. He was always worried about attacks. So Masada was, a way to defend his territory. But he expanded the amount of land that the temple would stand on in order to build a much more elaborate, beautiful temple. Now, some people call it the third temple. It's really the second temple that got, made into a bigger, more impressive affair. So they needed to expand the platform. And so that wall is a retaining wall. It is not a wall that ever was part of the temple. It was a retaining wall. But of course, it is right at the Temple Mount where the temple was. So that makes it holy for people. So that's the difference. Okay, any questions, comments? Oh, there's some comments in the chat. Let me just see. This should have been named Sefer Shemot. You're right. Yeah, lots. The only reason it's not is because the names are in the middle. So, the name of a book always comes from the beginning. Oh, it's a taxation for census for taxation purposes. Maybe I don't know. Why is that in a holy book like this? Except to, as I said, the documentation seems to be very important. Follow the money, Jason says. Yes, definitely, always. Oh no,
And remembering people's names. I mean, it is such an important issue, not only in Judaism, but other places. It's, saying the name.
Names are important. These were written in Hebrew. There's a little bit of Aramaic in the book of Daniel. And there might be some spots of Aramaic in here, but it's essentially in Hebrew. That was a question Harvey asked. Okay, any other questions before we read the end? Okay, let's get to the end of this. One more chapter. Okay, who would like to read?
I'm okay to read.
Okay, great. Thank you.
On that day, the book of Moses was read aloud in the hearing of the people, and there it was found written that no Ammonite or Moabite should ever be admitted into the assembly of God, because they had not met the Israelites with food and water, but had hired Balaam to call a curse down on them. Our God, however, turned the curse into a blessing. When the people heard this law, they excluded from Israel all who were of foreign descent.
Okay, so we'll stop for just 1 second, and I see Jane has your hand up. I just want to again point out the book of Ruth, which is supposedly written around the same time, is the exact opposite of this, right? Here it's purity, like we don't want anybody from the outside. But the book of Ruth says not so much. Like you might be a Moabite, you might be an Ammonite, you might be something else. What's important is who you are as a human being, right? Because Ruth becomes the great-great-grandmother of King David.
Right.
So, now there are two possibilities. There were people who want King David to look bad. So look who his mother was, a Moabite. Or my preferred version is, hey, this is not about, what tribe you're from or where your blood is from. This is about who you are as a person. And you get accepted into the community if you're a good person. Jane.
I was just going to ask about Ruth because she was a Moabite. So that's why this didn't make sense to me.
Right. So, this, first of all, the rabbis have a very simple way of dealing with this issue, because how do they reconcile this? I mean, the Bible does say you cannot have a Moabite in your community, right? And obviously there's some dispute within the community as to whether or not we should be so pure that we don't accept anybody else. I mean, there's no purity in the Israelites, right? They were theoretically a group of people who came out of Egypt. Along the way, they picked up a motley crew of people, and then they joined with some Canaanites when they got here. So the whole thing is crazy to begin with. I mean, they weren't a pure race or anything like that. But there is this idea that maybe there were people trying to make David look bad. But the rabbis, the way they deal with this problem, because how could King David's great-great-grandmother be a Moabite? Well, they read the text very, very closely and very carefully. And the text says no Moabite. It does not say no Moabitess. Get it? It's in the masculine because it's a gendered language, Hebrew. So no Moabite is it's masculine Moabite. It doesn't say no Moabitess in the feminine. So therefore, marrying Ruth was not a problem. You don't seem very impressed with that.
But it does say women, and it talks later about you shouldn't let your sons marry the neighboring people and
right.
Yeah, we just saw that.
Wait a minute, don't get so technical. Don't
Sounds like our
No.
white nationalists, though.
no, look, what they did was they said the grammar is such that it only prohibits males, not females. Okay, I mean, if you read it straightforwardly like that, yeah, that's true, even though they use male to mean male and female. Okay, that doesn't matter. Because, the rabbis have no problem taking a word and making it mean something completely different. But in this case, the grammar is such that it does support that position in a very, very technical sense. But you're not amused. Okay. This is what says in 5 other places you can't marry a woman from these places. That's not what they're talking about. Okay. All right, let's just, yes, Jenny.
Okay, well, I guess when we go back to the text, and I know that this continues in the rest of the reading. So the text specifically says that the people had not met Israel with bread and water. So it gives a specific reason, but then it says they separated, everyone who was foreign. And then later when we get to it, it'll say they didn't know the language. And I guess I'm thinking that this has had such profound implications for how Jews or Judaism have interacted with non-Jews that in a sense, I guess I'm wondering if Judaism had looked at the text and said, right, there's a difference between people who are not, supportive or helpful or friendly with us, or who are not interested in our customs and language. But and I'm just thinking, and this may be too big a sort of discussion, but how Judaism and relationships with non-Jews would have been different if the text had understood to say, those who want to help us or learn our ways or our customs, we welcome them into the community. But those who, curse us or don't help us or, want to keep separate from us, well, of course, they're not part of the community. And I was thinking that could have had profound implications for relations.
Yes. Now, I will say that there are competing strains in the tradition. Okay, this is a strain that says out. Okay, and as
one verse sort of distinguishes it was those who didn't give Israel bread and water, and then the next one says, okay, well then we're going to get rid of everyone. I mean, that's quite a leap.
Where does it say that? Let me go back.
Okay.
Let's go back to the text. Wait a second.
So 13 verse 2, since they did not meet Israel with bread and water and hired someone to curse them.
Oh, I see what you're saying. They go to a general, I see what you're saying.
And then they exclude everyone.
Yeah.
I'm just saying
that's
quite a leap.
Yes, it is a leap, definitely. So you're right about that, but I would say that yes, that is a strain, and Christine points out in the chat that this is very similar to our anti-immigration laws in this country. That is definitely a strain in it, and unfortunately, as I've mentioned before, there are those in Israel who will look to this to say these are the Palestinians and they deserve to be kicked out of here. They don't belong here. Okay. So there is that strain, but there's also the strain, the book of Ruth, for example, but not just the book of Ruth. I mean, for example, when Joshua goes in to conquer the land, he's helped by Rahab, who is a non-Israelite prostitute, right? And they help her and they save her and her family from, destruction. And by the way, how about all the wives, all the matriarchs? They're not Israelites.
Right.
So there's another strain of bringing people in,
right?
And also this whole thing about treating a stranger who's a resident alien, basically, that's how it's translated, treating them well and including them in your community. So they're the competing strains, number one. The other issue is, as I said just a couple minutes ago, Israelites are a motley crew. Okay, maybe there's this group from Egypt. Let's just say there was maybe a few. They go along, they pick up people along the way. It says that in the Torah, that they pick people up along the way. And then they get to Canaan, And there are a lot of theories about the Canaanites joining in with these people to create this new people called Israel. Now, how are they going to establish the boundaries of this identity when they've got people from all kinds of different groups, right? So they say, you cannot mix with these other people and you cannot do any of the things that they do. And that is a way to create this identity. So it's not like a wonderful thing to say, get rid of your wives who were Moabites or Ammonites or whatever. But the fact is, that is the way they are, at least intellectually, creating an identity.
Right.
But it has that unfortunate byproduct.
Right.
But yeah, you're right. If it were written differently, maybe things would be different. Because unfortunately, you can support a lot of what you believe by picking different verses in here, right?
Yeah.
So you can pick the verse that says, get rid of all these foreigners out, right? Or you can say, you have an obligation to take care of the stranger.
Yeah.
I'm just looking what.
I was just struck by, just 2 sentences apart. It's the people who just didn't help Israel, and then it's okay, get rid of everyone.
Good point. That's a good point. That's a very good point. And frankly, here's another problem. You get, Moses is in Midian, right? And he ends up marrying a Midianite woman. Again, not somebody from his clan or anything. And Jethro is the priest of Midian, right? Who comes and not only, offers his daughter to Moses, but offers Moses a lot of really, really good advice about how to handle, judging the people, right? When Moses is taking it on completely on his own, right? Later in the book of Numbers, anybody remember Pinchas? Who remembers Pinchas? What does he do?
I don't remember what he did. That's the problem.
Jason does. Shish kebab, right? Okay, so he I'm sorry. He finds an Israelite who is having sex with a Midianite woman. And apparently the Midianites got together with, I think, the Moabites or the Amalekites in order to, seduce the men and then take over and, kill them. Now all of a sudden the Midianites are enemies. How did that happen? I mean, there's no real explanation, right? I mean, you had these people who were pals with, with the Israelites, right? Intermarrying, helping each other. Now all of a sudden they're the enemy. So consistency is not part of this at all.
Right.
Let's see, another message. Let's see. A paranoid state almost always includes this kind of circling the wagons nationalism. Yes, correct, Christine. Thank you. There's always a strand of patriarchy that views women as potential sources of group impurity. Okay, that's good to know. And you would know that from your work. An identity based on exclusion is, in my view, doomed and inherently repressive. Yes. And Harvey says, wasn't there a method of conversion assimilation at that time? No, there was no such thing as conversion the way we understand it now, right? Conversion. Oh, Ollie's not happy about this either. So conversion, Ruth is considered the first convert. But all she does is say, I'm going to go with you to her mother-in-law. That's all she says. She doesn't go through, a year of study or a Beit Din or anything. There was no such thing in those days. So yeah, you could join forces. You could say, you are going to be, my people, and your God's going to be my God. And that's all it took, really. And you have to be circumcised if you're a male, obviously. But, okay. Final stretch.
Right.
Okay, where are we? Right.
All right. So verse 4. So before this, Eliashib the priest had been put in charge of the storerooms of the house of our God. He was closely associated with Tobiah, and he had provided him with a large room formerly used to store the grain offerings and incense and temple articles, and also the tithes of grain, new wine, and olive oil prescribed for the Levites, musicians, and gatekeepers, as well as the contributions for the priests. But while all this was going on, I was not in Jerusalem, for in the 32nd year of Artaxerxes, king of Babylon, I had returned to the king. At some time later, I asked his permission and came back to Jerusalem. Here I learned about the evil thing Eliashib had done in providing Tobiah a room in the courts of the house of God. I was greatly displeased and threw all Tobiah's household's goods out of the room. I gave orders to purify the rooms, and then I put back into them the equipment of the house of God and the grain offerings and the incense. I also learned that the portions assigned to the Levites had not been given to them, and that all the Levites and musicians responsible for the service had gone back to their own fields. So I rebuked the officials and asked them, "Why is the house of God neglected?" Then I called them together and stationed them at their posts. All Judah brought the tithes of grain, new wine, and olive oil into the storerooms. I put Shlemiah the priest, Zadok the scribe, and a Levite named Pedaiah in charge of the storerooms, and made Hanan, son of Zakur, the son of Mattaniah, their assistant, because they were considered trustworthy. They were made responsible for distributing the supplies to their fellow Levites. Remember me for this, my God, and do not blot out what I have so faithfully done for the house of my God and its services. In those days, I saw people in Judah treading wine presses on the Sabbath and bringing in grain and loading it on donkeys, together with wine, grapes, figs, and all other kinds of loads. And they were bringing all this into Jerusalem on the Sabbath. Therefore, I warned them against selling food on that day. People from Tyre who lived in Jerusalem were bringing in fish and all kinds of merchandise and selling them in Jerusalem on the Sabbath to the people of Judah. I rebuked the nobles of Judah and said to them, "What is this wicked thing you are doing, desecrating the Sabbath day? Didn't your ancestors do the same thing, so that our God brought all this calamity on us and on this city? Now you are stirring up more wrath against Israel by desecrating the Sabbath." When evening shadows fell on the gates of Jerusalem before the Sabbath, I ordered the doors to be shut and not opened until the Sabbath was over. I stationed some of my own men at the gate so that no load could be brought in on the Sabbath day. Once or twice, the merchants and sellers of all kinds of goods spent the night outside Jerusalem, but I warned them and said, "Why do you spend the night by the wall? If you do this again, I will arrest you." From that time on, they no longer came on the Sabbath. Then I commanded the Levites to purify themselves and go over and guard the gates in order to keep the Sabbath day holy. Remember me for this also, my God, and show mercy to me according to your great love.
Let's just stop for 1 second. I just want to make sure you understand what the problem here is that on the Sabbath, you're not supposed to be engaging in commerce. And that's what these people are doing here, right? They're selling their wares. And also these merchants that are sitting outside the wall, they're hoping that they can slip in, even if it's the Sabbath, right? So he's trying to make sure that they are going to be respectful of the Sabbath, which is, again, prioritizing the Sabbath over almost everything else, and also making sure that the temple has, what it needs, right? They brought all the stuff to the temple and made sure, the priests have what they're supposed to have, et cetera, et cetera. So again, the priority is on the cult much more than on anything else. Let's see, right down here.
23.
Yeah.
Moreover, in those days, I saw men of Judah who had married women from Ashdod, Ammon, and Moab. Half of their children spoke the language of Ashdod or the language of one of the other peoples and did not know how to speak the language of Judah. I rebuked them and called curses down on them. I beat some of the men and pulled out their hair. I made them take an oath in God's name and said, "You are not to give your daughters in marriage to their sons, nor are you to take their daughters in marriage for your sons or for yourselves." Was it not because of the marriages like these that Solomon, king of Israel, sinned? Among the many nations, there was no king like him. He was loved by his God, and God made him king over all Israel, but even he was led into sin by foreign women. Must we hear now that you too are doing all this terrible wickedness and are being unfaithful to our God by marrying foreign women?
So let me just point out here one thing, sorry. Notice that despite all of the reading of the Torah and admonishing the people between Ezra and Nehemiah to not be involved with foreign women, they're still doing it, right? He said, like, let's split up and make them go away, but they're still doing it. So there's actually no proof that all these women and these children were abandoned. I mean, maybe it happened, we don't know, but certainly it doesn't seem like they're, adhering to this edict to not marry these foreign women. Okay.
One of the sons of Joada, son of Elishib, the high priest, was the son-in-law to Sanballat, the Horonite, and I drove him away from me. Remember them, my God, because they defiled the priestly office and the covenant of the priesthood and of the Levites. So I purified the priests and the Levites of everything foreign and assigned them duties, each to his own task. I also made provision for contributions of wood at designated times and for the first fruits. Remember me with favor, my God.
So in these two books of Ezra and Nehemiah, there are two kinds of leadership. So Ezra's more the kind of guy who finds out, oh dear, we haven't been good. And he starts, tearing his clothing and putting, sackcloth on and ashes on his head and stuff as a kind of like, I'm part of the whole thing. And, giving as an example himself as someone who is going to be repentant about these things. And then people follow him. Nehemiah is more the kind of guy that likes to boss people around, tell people what to do. And I love this thing here. I rebuked these people. I beat the men and pulled out their hair. I mean, that's an interesting way of being a leader.
Right.
Okay. So, yes, Jenny.
Yeah. So I guess that's what I was referring to earlier, that, there would have been another way to resolve this by like telling the people, come learn our language, learn our customs. There would have been an inclusive way to handle this as opposed to, okay, you're out. And, that's, I just thought our history might have been different.
But you know what? You're absolutely right. But think about how most places handle outsiders, right? Are we kind to outsiders? Do we say, hey, come learn our language? We're going, no, the replacement theory, right? This is what we're dealing with right now. They're going to destroy our culture, not add to it or, enrich it. We're going to be destroyed because all these other cultures are coming in, right?
Right.
And yes, go ahead, Sherry.
What occurs to me when we've read this is at some point in society, I think people gather in groups and they crave some form of identity.
Mhm.
Maybe Christine can address this. That could be why the white nationalists are so together today, is because they don't want to be a part of this group or that group. So people are gathering in groups naturally. Maybe an anthropologist could address that. I don't know. It just seems like this passage kind of addresses why Judaism came to be and needs to be coherent with one people.
Mm-hmm. Good. Do you want to address that, Christine, or?
My internet connection is horrendous, and actually most tribes are inclusive, but we're really dealing with state formation here, and they may still call themselves tribes, but it's really not. It's really about the formation of a state. And I also recall, I just put it in the chat, that by people defaulting and marrying people around them, which is what happens, the fact that these women are not seen as belonging is always a club that's used as threatening them with expulsion in their marriages and reinforcing the patriarchal character of the marriages, which is pretty awful too. But I hope my
Yeah, we hear you. You're fine.
okay, because I keep getting cut out and
sorry,
and not being able to hear anybody, right? So which is why I'm on chat like insane.
Which is why I'm recording this, and you can watch it if you want.
Thank you.
Okay. So good. All right. Yeah, unfortunately, I think this reflects how people are. I wish it were different, but it isn't.
Well,
I wonder
people
how,
on the plus side, people are always marrying the people that they run across.
Of course, that's the whole thing with so-called
Yeah.
assimilation of Jews in this country, right? You're going to be
Exactly.
working next to someone who's not Jewish, and you'll fall in
You
love.
fall in love. So it
Jason.
happens.
well, I
I'm
think
curious.
that's
Can
the
you,
role.
Jason.
can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, sorry, my microphone was acting up earlier. I'm just curious if there was still any plural marriage at this time,
Yeah.
because
Oh, yeah.
because it would seem to me that you could create situations where, there were not enough women within the tribes, and if they were needing more children for whatever to work their fields, or they had to go somewhere to find wives, right? If there weren't
That's
enough
a
available.
good point.
If
That's a
there's
good
not an
point.
even distribution in the society, right?
No, that's a good point. And also, they're living in the land. There are other people there. They interact. It happens.
People
Go ahead. Oh, Christine's unfortunately
have
disappeared.
always been messy from the time that we were like little, pre-humans running around on the savannah.
Jenny, did you have something you wanted?
Oh, I was just thinking, chicken or egg, is it the lead, I guess that's the role of leadership. If leadership says, foreigners are bad, that sort of sets a tone. And if leadership says we welcome these people, so there may be a tendency for people to be tribal, but I think if you have leadership that says we can do it a different way, then people can, say, oh, okay, we can do it a different way. And so I think it's just interesting. And I know, Suzanne, you're saying that the Torah does say different things in different places, but I think that these comments about foreigners are so powerful that if they're not counteracted by someone saying, no, we can do things differently, that's almost the default position. And that's what I'm pushing against.
No, absolutely.
Default position is being tribal, and you need people to stand up and say that is not the only or the best way to do things.
Right. I completely agree with you. And yes, Carl.
Just as a footnote, I think cultures, even within a culture, as we see in our own, have ambivalent views about the other foreigners. And as you're talking, I'm thinking about Comanches in Texas who despised white people, but would raid white settlements, kill the parents, and capture the kids and raise them as Comanches. And those blonde, blue-eyed kids were Comanches as far as the Comanches were concerned. And they would go raid other settlements. They would raid into Mexico and settlements in the Plains area and throughout Texas, and raise these kids as Comanches. They were Comanches as far as the Comanches were concerned. Who cared what they looked like?
That's very funny.
They spoke fluent Comanche. They did Comanche things.
That's right.
And Carl, isn't in pre-Revolutionary War America, there were, I can't remember her name, there was a child captured by the Indians, and
Mary Jemison.
that's
a bunch
the
of
one,
them,
right?
yes.
And they sent out a squad to rescue her, and she didn't want to be rescued.
No.
She didn't want to go back into white society. She was treated better, by Indian, Iroquois or Indian society than she was in white society.
Well, she probably had a handsome husband, so she wasn't going to leave him. Maybe
I think
children.
she wasn't.
She did have children, actually. She had two
Yeah.
children. And she did love her husband by her own account, which she later wrote down for everybody.
Yeah,
There you
that's
go.
right.
There you
That's
go.
right.
So I think we see the two tendencies here. I mean, there, as you all probably know, it says 36 times in the Torah that we should care for the stranger, right? I mean, 36 times is a very important number. It's twice high. And it's the thing that's repeated the most. So there is that kind of tendency to embrace the stranger and to be kind to the stranger and to remember that we were strangers, right? And every year at the Seder, we're supposed to be as though we were personally slaves in Egypt. So we know what it's like. And yet there's the other strain the tribal strain, right? And they're both
This
there.
is driving me crazy to call it tribal.
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm sorry. What should I call it?
It's like the
Ethnic?
opposite.
Okay, should I call it ethnic?
Well, I mean, because the borders, there are no borders in non-state peoples. You know, you have this inclusion, as Carl pointed out. There are ways of including people. There are lots of ways of including people.
Right.
The
Okay.
Stan, when you go visit, they name you, and then you are inserted into their kinship system in that name. So all the people that are that name's parents and relatives are your names and relatives in the same way. I mean, there are lots and lots of ways of inclusion.
Okay.
Tribalism is an artifact of the state, where
Okay.
it sees borders as identity.
Okay. All right.
So
Thank you for the
tribalism
clarification.
is okay, but calling it
Tri-
tribal, not so much.
Tribalism. Okay. Okay. All right, Sherry.
Then there's also the notion of too much non-exclusion is going to create a genetic pool, which Jews obviously have in Ashkenazi, and breast cancer and those kind of things. So you have the intermarriage thing, where you have a small pool of genetic genes, and then that causes problems. So you need to include outsiders.
Yeah.
So
Well,
you don't have that.
it's
Okay,
always a
here's-
better gene pool if it's diverse, but
That's what I'm saying. That's what
yeah.
I'm
That's what
saying.
she's saying. So Jason says, I'd imagine life was significantly better for women with the Iroquois or Seneca or
Yes.
whichever tribe than it was in Puritan New England.
Absolutely.
Okay. All right. So when we finish a book of the Torah, we say Chazak Chazak Benit Chazek. So having just finished the book of Ezra and Nehemiah, which were apparently once one book, let's say that Chazak Chazak Benit Chazek. He will be strengthened by this wonderful stuff. All right, so we have a little bit of time, so I want to do a little introduction to the, they're called the major prophets. So they're major and minor prophets. And you have the book, the section of the Tanakh called Nevi'im, which is prophets, which included the historical prophets that we read, right? We had Joshua, Judges, First and Second Samuel, and First and Second Kings. Okay, that's the historical prophets where you had Prophet Samuel, Nathan, Elijah, Elisha, etc. Now and those are prophets that were part of the history. Now we're going into the three major prophets are Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel in that order. Only major because there's more material, not because they're more important. Because then you have the 12 minor prophets. Again, minor only because the books are smaller, not because they're less important. So in the minor prophets, you have Amos, Hosea, Jonah, etc. Right? We're not going to get to them. So Isaiah has the biggest section of the prophets. And it's thought that it's probably 3 different clumps of material. I don't think any of this is written by one person, but certainly, even though everything is included in a book called Isaiah, it was not written all in the same time period. So that's one thing to keep in mind. But I want to tell you a little bit about these prophets generally. So I'm going to read you some of my notes from the prophets class I took many, many years ago. Now, these prophets are going to offer a critique of society, and their critique is not about the cult. Okay, it's not about, why aren't you bringing sacrifices, or why are you intermarrying, or, whatever. It's about justice, about bringing justice to those who are the most vulnerable in our society. And they offer a tough critique. And this critique is very hard to take. Now, the prophet is seen as an intercessor between God and the people. So on the one hand, the prophet is the mouthpiece of God, right? God's word is coming through the prophet. Now, it doesn't come directly because each prophet has their own individual personality and individual style of, conveying their message. Ezekiel, for example, is sort of a performance artist and does all kinds of crazy things. So it's filtered through a particular individual, but it's supposedly God.
Hey.
Oh.
What have you got here?
Christine.
Christine, you have to.
I muted her. Okay. Yeah, she's got dogs that, yeah, just like me, that get in the way. So on the one hand, they critique the people for not doing justice. On the other hand, God gets really angry, of course, and wants to destroy the people. And then the prophet intercedes and says, oh, let's not go too far, or we'll kill a few thousand, like when Moses, is defending the people, but they've done this golden calf thing. We'll kill a few thousand, but let's not destroy all the people, because what would everybody say about you? That was Moses's argument. And by the way, with these critiques, there's always what's called a nechemta, which is a kind of consolation. Like, okay, you people have been bad. You have not cared for the widow, the orphan, the stranger. You are going to be punished. But there will be a redemption at the end of all of that. Okay, you'll be eventually forgiven. Isaiah, actually, his call, it's his theophany when he first encounters God. God says, I'm going to send somebody out there. Who's going to go? And Isaiah says, I'll go. Well, you're going to tell the people that there'll be total destruction, and a tiny little remnant will eventually come back. That's kind of the nechemta. It's pretty sad. So most of these people were speakers, and then we're reading a book. So for the most part, what we have is their disciples wrote stuff down. We don't necessarily have the direct words that they said. Maybe the disciples were really good at taking down the words, but they're also instrumental in shaping the social and religious identity of Israel. And what they spoke about became characteristic of the biblical religion, but it wasn't normative. In other words, they're critiquing what is not happening in their society, even though those are the things that, the Israelite religion should be all about. Now, some of them speak from outside, like Amos is an outside agitator, whereas Isaiah is working in the king's court. And there's a range of how they're perceived. Some of them get jailed, like Jeremiah gets jailed, right, for these terrible prophecies. So even though they addressed the people of their own time, what they talked about is really, a message that carries forth beyond time. It doesn't have to be, located at that particular place. And, they're not, for the most part, I don't think their messages are appreciated too much. It's only much later that we say, this guy knew what he was talking about. Now, I want to, by the way, Reform Judaism, just FYI, was much more focused on prophetic Judaism than on the rest of the Torah. Why? Why do you think that is? Open it up for a second. Why would prophetic Judaism be important rather than the rest of, let's say, the Torah?
Well, the social
Because of
justice part.
ritual, not following ritual, maybe not with Reform Judaism, not as much ritual.
Yeah. Well, so the Reform Judaism, the focus really was for a very long time, it still is to a great extent, is social justice.
Right.
And the prophets are speaking about social justice, right? Whereas, unfortunately, the rest of a lot of the Torah is all those commandments that, the Reform movement rejected at that point. I'm talking about the beginning of Reform. Little by little, that other stuff has been reincorporated, but the social justice aspect was very, very important. So that's where they really, kind of focused their attention. Now, there's a book by Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel, called The Prophets. I highly recommend it. I'm going to read you a few excerpts that really, I think, really capture what the prophets are all about. So he says, the situation of a person immersed in the prophet's words is one of being exposed to a ceaseless shattering of indifference, and one needs a skull of stone to remain callous to such blows. So he talks about the words of the prophets being a ceaseless shattering of indifference. They're trying to wake you up out of your indifference. Like, okay, folks, Things are bad, wake up, do something about it, right? And it's not like I'm going to say it to you in a sweet way. It's almost like Nehemiah pulling out your hair, but doing it with words. Okay. The prophets do not offer reflections about ideas in general. Listen to this. Their words are onslaughts, scuttling illusions of false security, challenging evasions, calling faith to account, questioning prudence and impartiality. Okay. So if you listen to the word of a prophet, you are not going to sit there and go, oh, this will put me to sleep. I actually sometimes listen to some podcasts to go to sleep by, sort of droning, some of the droning, discussions. But if you listen to a prophet, that is not going to happen. That is not a good way to try to go to sleep. For prophecy is a sham unless it is experienced as a word of God swooping down on man and converting him into a prophet. It is, of course, written in very male language because this is, early 20th century, whatever. We excuse him for that. The prophets endure and can only be ignored at the risk of our own despair. It is for us to decide whether freedom is self-assertion or response to a demand, whether the ultimate situation is conflict or concern. Prophet is neither a singing saint nor a moralizing poet, but an assaulter of the mind. Often his words begin to burn where conscience ends. I mean, these are really powerful statements. They're all pretty similar ultimately, but this is really, he really kind of embodies what it means to be a prophet in these words. The prophet disdains those for whom God's presence is comfort and security, right? People who go into religion to say, oh, this is going to make me okay with my life or with the situation in the world. Not for Heschel, not for the prophets. This is about waking up and not being comfortable at all. Because if you're comfortable, you let a lot of bad things happen in the world. To the prophet, it's a challenge and an incessant demand. God is compassion, not compromise. Justice, though not inclemency. And here, the prophet's word is a scream in the night. While the world is at ease and asleep, the prophet feels the blast from heaven. So, I mean, these are very, very beautiful words. And then here a little more. To us, injustice is injurious to the welfare of the people. To the prophets, it's a death blow to existence. To us, an episode, to them, a catastrophe, a threat to the world. So in other words, we could say, oh, isn't it terrible? There's so many homeless people. It's terrible. But for the prophet, it is terrible. What are we going to do about it? Get off your butt and do something about it, right? And as he says here, his images must not shine, but burn. It has to burn. It has to push us to action. The prophet is intent on intensifying responsibility, is impatient of excuse, contemptuous of pretense and self-pity. Oh, the world is so gross and there's nothing I can do about it. Yes, you can. Get out there. The mouth of the prophet is a sharp sword. He is a polished arrow taken out of the quiver of God. Reading the words of the prophets is a strain on the emotions, wrenching one's conscience from the state of suspended animation. So, yes, Jason, the words of the prophets are written on the subway walls and tenement halls. True, that is very much in the spirit of the prophets. So thank you for reminding us of that. And if you're interested, I can send you these quotes, or you can get the book and read it yourself.
Would you repeat the book?
Oh, it's called The Prophets.
Yes.
By Abraham. Prophets, yeah. Prophets.
Yes.
Not FITAs. Which, unfortunately, somebody taught the little kids that the prophets were PROFITS.
Yeah.
And they all wrote it in their exams. And it was like, okay, we have to learn how to spell.
But who's the author? Who's the author?
Abraham Joshua Heschel, Heschel. So before we start with Isaiah, any thoughts or comments about the general role of the prophet? And the prophet, puts himself out there. And now, obviously, there were some women prophets, but they don't have their own books. And even Devorah, who is a prophet, who is in the book of Judges, who is a judge and a prophet, or remember Huldah? Who remembers Huldah? What did Huldah do?
I remember her, but I don't know what she did.
What did she do?
She discovered the scroll.
Well, she authenticated it.
She authenticated the scroll.
Yeah. Good. Remember Huldah. Okay. My professor Tamara Eskenazi would be very, very happy to hear that. Okay, so I'm gonna read you a little bit about Isaiah. Well, one of the things that's important to keep in mind is a lot of this material is poetry. And do you have any thoughts about why it's poetry as opposed to prose?
What was it written as poetry, or is it only translated as poetry?
That's an interesting question. I do not know. Because, as I said, it was orally transmitted, but then written down. And then, of course, there was an editor, so I'm not sure. But I think it was delivered in poetry. I'll tell you why in a second. Go ahead, Christine.
I think that because, as Stanley Nyman said, poetry is a rope bridge across the chasm of biology. And
okay, explain that to us, please.
Okay. In other words, only humans do it, and that it is a language of creating a world out of an existing world, but a world to live by.
Okay, nice.
AI can do it, as
AI,
we saw.
yeah.
As we saw.
Pretty soon, our prophets will be named AI CPT. Okay, Jane.
Poetry is very succinct. I think it's a great way to get a message across. And at the same time, it can be very elliptical. So you can read a lot into it. It's a very multifaceted way of approaching somebody's brain, of engaging engaging their attention.
Good. It is. I think it is also the way biblical poetry works is you usually have like a couplet, and the first part of it says one thing, and then the second part says the same thing in slightly different ways. So it's a mnemonic. It's a way to remember, because the rhythm of the poetry, the way in which it might rhyme, the way in which it's like learning a prayer. It's a lot easier when you know the music to it, at least for a lot of people.
Yeah, I was going to say, if you put these poems to music, when I first started my exploration of Judaism, I didn't know anything, and I certainly didn't know any Hebrew. And the way I learned it was through the chanting, through the songs. That's how I first learned anything.
Yes, it makes it a lot
easy
easier
to remember.
Yep, it is easier. And again, the rhythm and the way in which the words resonate with each other and all that, which you're not going to completely get in the English, but it'll be close enough. As I mentioned also for Isaiah, there are many writers. It's not like one writer, even though it's all called Isaiah. Again, it was written in different periods of time. I'm going to just read you a little bit at the beginning of Isaiah. I'm not going to, excuse me, I'm not going to share the screen because I just want to see how it comes across as an oral thing, which is how it was delivered. And next week we'll look at some actual text. But so the vision of Isaiah, son of Amoz, that he saw concerning Judah and Jerusalem in the days of Uzziah, Jotham, Ahaz, Hezekiah, kings of Judah, a number of different kings that he served under. Hear, O heavens, and give ear, O earth, for the Lord has spoken. Sons I have nurtured and raised, but they rebelled against me. The ox knows its owner, and the donkey its master's stall. Israel did not know, my people did not pay heed. Woe, offending nation, people weighed down with crime, seed of evildoers, sons acting ruinously. They have forsaken the Lord, scorned Israel's Holy One. They have fallen behind. Why would you be beaten more, still swerving from the way? Every head is sick and every heart in pain. From foot sole to head, no place in him intact. Wound, bruise, and open sore, not drained, not bandaged, nor soothed with oil. Your land is desolate. Your towns are burned in fire. Your soil before your eyes. Strangers devour it, and desolation like an upheaval by strangers. And the daughter of Zion remains like a hut in a vineyard, like a shed in a patch of greens, like a town besieged. Had not the Lord of armies left us a scant remnant, we would be like Sodom. We would resemble Gomorrah. So I'm just going to stop there. So there is this, you may have heard the repetitions or the slight, equivalent in the next part of the verse. And what he's saying is, the land is desolate. You are desolate. Personally, you've been really hurt and really, pounded because you wouldn't listen to God. And that's how he started. Now he says there's going to be a remnant, and we'll talk about that more next time with his theophany. There's going to be a remnant, otherwise you would have been like Sodom and Gomorrah, which was completely destroyed. But, knowing that there's going to be a teensy little remnant is not all that, uplifting. Because that means most of us are going to die. Yeah, sayonara, exactly. So I'm just going to read you what Robert Alter says at the beginning. The true beginning of Isaiah's prophecies is chapter 6. That's where his theophany is. The visionary scene in the temple where he is first commissioned as a prophet. The prophecy that immediately follows here may have been said at the beginning of the book by its editors because the invocation of heaven and earth. Does that sound familiar to you? Invoking heaven and earth basically as witnesses. Does that sound familiar to anybody?
Sounds like Bereshit.
Well, Bereshit in the sense of God creating heaven and earth, but calling to witness. Anybody remember who called heaven and earth to witness during a final speech?
Moses.
Exactly, Moses. That's what Moses says. I call heaven and earth to witness as he delivers basically the book of Deuteronomy. Well, his final tome anyway. The Song of Moses, right? Now, the donkey, its master's stall. So the ox knows its owner, and the donkey, its master's stall. So, that's one verse. So you have the ox knows its owner, and the donkey knows its owner. That's the parallel there. And it's an illustration of the pattern of focusing or concretization in the movement from the first verse to the second. The first verse puts forth a general relation of beast to owner. The second verse, he calls it, in the parallels, and the verb to know does double duty for both. Okay, it's too complicated, but the point is, there's a general statement, the ox knows its owner, kind of saying the animals know to whom they should listen, just the way we should know whom we should be listening to, right? And then it gets more specific, right, by saying that the donkey knows its master's stall. It's very concrete. So that's sort of the pattern of biblical poetry. So that's just a little tease for Isaiah, which we will talk about some more next week, which will be our final Torah study for the year. So, yeah. Any last words before we go? Okay. I'm going to stop recording.